Welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental issues that green up our world. Our guest is Dr. Bernd Blossey, Professor of Natural Resources and Director of the Ecology and Management of Invasive Plants program at Cornell University. Today we'll hear some insights from his fascinating work, which focuses on not just plants, but the creatures that interact with them, such as insects, earthworms, and deer. Dr. Blossey, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I met you, I think it was 7 years ago at Cornell, where you had a conference on Phragmites, which is that reed that was native to Europe and now is spread across North America. And you graciously agreed to have a little interview with me afterwards. And I was looking at the footage the other day, and it's kind of fun because some of the things you were saying kind of go against the grain of what other people were saying at the conference, such as you had a problem with the terminology that we tend to use, this war analogy.
Yeah, oh, I hate that.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, these are attitude things. We are not at war with nature. There can be native species, there can be introduced species that can be destructive. But we're not at war with them. We don't appreciate some of the effects, and we're trying to lessen them. At war, very often people use eradication and we need to eliminate them. That's not what I'm after. That's not what we should be after. It's a distraction using that. And they're out to destroy and obliterate, and I think that's, first, it's not the right approach. And second, they get carried away once information may come to light where that enemy that they see may no longer be an enemy, but maybe an asset, or the role changes depending on the abundance. So I don't like it at all.
And another thing you said that day, you were mentioning that you feel that the herbiciding of very large areas, miles and miles of Phragmites being herbicided, because there's miles and miles of Phragmites along our coastlines and in our along our roadsides, that you were saying that that's not the right approach, and that's different than some of the land managers.
So we're here where the Great Lakes Commission is. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative spends enormous amounts of money of trying to improve the living conditions for native species in the Great Lakes. I looked at that for Phragmites in particular, and they have spent $25 million over the last 5 years on herbicide alone for Phragmites treatment. So they go out and spray, and they say, yep, we can kill it. And then a couple of years later, it's all back. So we've done studies with other folks in the Adirondacks. Eradication, one thing, is no longer possible once populations exceed 100 square meters. So that's 100 by 100 yards. Wow. And the devastation that comes from herbicide, their legacy effects, is totally unknown. We have no idea about the outcome other than we can kill some Phragmites. And did we actually make the conditions better for the native species? Nobody studies that. We are trying that to understand those effects. And the long-term effects are basically Phragmites continues to spread, and it's the total wrong approach to do that. It's massive. It's a war. That goes back to your first question, right? And it's not the right approach, and it's not helpful.
So what are approaches that you like?
Well, there are a couple of approaches. We're trying to develop biocontrol for the plant, and we're pretty close. We have good organisms that we're considering safe, because there's also some native Phragmites. And we will submit the petition to the field release of these organisms in the next 4 weeks. So I'm just revising.
Like a wasp, or what is
those are two moth species that feed internally in the stems as larvae. They overwinter as eggs. And we feel they're safe, and people will evaluate that now. We're submitting a petition at the federal level now. Great. But if we don't have it approved, then the question is, what do you do if you don't have the biocontrol agents? And we don't know whether they will be successful, right? That would be seen in the future. We can never be certain about that.
Well, you certainly had good success with purple loosestrife.
Yep. I wasn't having the success. The insects were. Right? I just gave them a little helping hand, a new start in North America.
I remember seeing purple loosestrife all over.
It worked
20, 30 years ago.
Beautifully, right? And so we hope the same can happen for Phragmites, but we can never be sure. So in the meantime, we're suggesting to focus on the very small populations, where you may still have an intact wetland with lots of native species, and it's not just all Phragmites. That means you need to find those locations and treat them with very little herbicide. I'm not fundamentally opposed to herbicide. Just on the widespread use of it, it's just not acceptable to me because it doesn't result in an improvement for the living conditions for native species. So go after the very small populations when the first stems are occurring somewhere. Treat those, and you have the native species that are still there that can take over that space. If you treat areas that are large, the native species usually don't have the ability to colonize that quickly, or it's Phragmites that comes in, or cattail, or any other invasive species that you may have. So it's a very different approach, but it's not this big hammer. It's the small, dedicated people that go and find the individual Phragmites stems in a stand of native plants and treat them that way.
Requires a fair amount of vigilance. You know, we need to be out there looking.
It requires some knowledge. It requires early action, and not this massive dose of once a system has so fundamentally changed. If we have Phragmites
kind of like
as
prevention.
Prevention
is worth a pound of cure kind of thing.
That's right. Change your diet before you have the heart attack kind of situation. That's what I would say.
Okay.
So.
All right, well, how about garlic mustard? Some people are saying that might actually burn itself out if we just let it go.
We have all the data for that.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So we have done studies from New Jersey all the way to Minnesota, and it's the same. So garlic mustard kind of spread from east to west. It hasn't been as long in Minnesota as it has been in New Jersey. There's some differences because it made some jumps to Chicago and other places. But we have done long-term research sites in the anticipation that we would introduce biocontrols for garlic mustard as well. So we said we need to understand what garlic mustard or how it behaves in the environments. And once we look at these long-term records, garlic mustard disappears if you don't do anything.
Wow.
If you pull, if you spray, and the garlic mustard challenge is coming up in in Michigan, right, where people schlep bags full of garlic mustard out of the woods, that's detrimental. It prevents that disappearance of garlic mustard. So the scientific explanation is negative soil feedback. So garlic mustard amplifies organisms in the soil that are detrimental to garlic mustard growth.
Wow.
We do agricultural rotation because that's a very, very common effect. So you don't plant, well, we do sometimes plant corn on corn on corn, but most often farmers rotate crops around to avoid this negative soil build-up effect. So don't do anything to garlic mustard. It will disappear on its own, but it takes about a decade.
If you can stomach watching it.
Oh, we did. We schlepped garlic mustard out of our woods for years, and we didn't make a difference. The plant kept on spreading, was the same abundance, still robust, big leaves. If you don't do it, if you have the patience to look, it will sort itself out.
Well, another new
You seem skeptical.
Well,
try it. Do you have it in your yard somewhere?
I have a tiny yard, and believe me, I'm going to keep taking it out. I can't.
That's okay if you find the first ones.
Yeah.
So in small little areas, that's okay. But if you want to win the garlic mustard challenge, you're not going to go to the small little populations.
Okay.
It's with Phragmites. If you find the first couple that arrive, take them out. That would be
that makes
okay.
sense.
It's protection again, right? But these big infestations that we have, big populations, walking away, sitting on your porch, having a cider or a beer or a fruit juice is much more helpful than pulling it out.
I'll try it, maybe. All right, how about earthworms? That's a new area for me that I grew up thinking earthworms were wonderful for the soil, and but now we're
Where's
hearing...
that attitude coming from?
That's
because
what I
you
was
garden?
Yeah.
Okay, so you think your plants grow better with earthworms?
Yeah.
Where are your plants from that you garden with? Are they from Europe? Some of them are. Yeah.
So that's how we got the introduced earthworms?
Well, there are some native earthworms, and people think they were pushed out of the areas that were glaciated. So we have some native earthworms in the south. We have some wonderful prairie earthworms that can be really big, but they're almost endangered. In the Palouse Prairie, there's a really big, I've looked at a couple of individuals in captivity, but they didn't seem to be destructive to the forests in the north. Our systems, in the way that they developed after the last glaciation, was all fungal decomposition, no earthworms in them. Why they didn't come back north, I don't know. That's the idea. And then Europeans came to this country and said, no earthworms in the soil. We need to bring some earthworms to better the soil. So that's how we got them early on, the big nightcrawler kind of situations. We now have a bunch of Asian species that were added to the mix. We have 15, 18 different species that run through the country.
So what's the problem with them?
They destroy the leaf litter layer. If you go to a forest where you don't have earthworms and you walk barefooted, maybe if you can do that, you will see that it's spongy because you have a leaf litter layer and that soaks up all the moisture. You don't have many hills here, but where I live in Ithaca, we have the slopes and they're being eroded if you have earthworms in there because the water holding capacity is greatly reduced. A lot of organisms are living in the leaf litter layer, including insects, spiders, or more charismatic species, if you want to think about that, like salamanders. Birds use whatever is living in the leaf litter layer. Earthworms destroy that. And the woods then look like an agricultural field, where you basically have annual inputs of litter and then just the mineral soil.
And it seems like drought would have more devastating impacts.
A lot of the native species, the plant species, root in the stuff layer, the spongy layer. And so they have difficulties because they also interact with a lot of microorganisms, mycorrhizae or so, helping plant growth. If you have earthworms in there, it's really difficult for them. It's particularly difficult for seedlings to get established. We know, so you are right as a gardener, knowing that your earthworms don't seem to be bothering the big plants that you put in. We've done experiments in areas where you have lots of earthworm seedlings have a great difficulty of establishing. But over time, the ones that survive do pretty well with earthworms because they're providing a lot of nutrients through their feeding efforts. But you don't want them in the woods.
And what's the impact of deer, the interaction with earthworms?
So we did work for the last decade in New York and different places. And high deer population facilitate earthworms. So we don't know exactly how that works. We know that earthworms are eating deer feces. So it's great, right? You probably put some horse manure in your garden occasionally.
I guess,
Yeah, so there's lots of nutrients in there. The deer produce something similar, right? Looks different, smells different. Earthworms would eat it. But where you have high deer populations, earthworm populations seem to be very high as well. And the earthworms facilitate invasive plants. For example, you will not find a garlic mustard or a microstegium where you do not have earthworms. Earthworms first, invasive plant species like the two that I mentioned second. The deer, through their effect of amplifying earthworm populations, facilitate invasive species then. So there are some loops that we don't fully understand how that actually happens, but so it's obviously everything is connected. So there are some very interesting relationships that we have uncovered over the last decade.
That makes sense because I'd heard about these cascading effects that when you have deer, sometimes you get more invasive species and then you have less insects and birds and such too?
Yeah, if the birds, often birds, for example, living on the forest floor, if you don't have a litter on a forest floor or no vegetation, they can't build their ovens in ways that it's inconspicuous to predators or so. They don't have the food resources because they feed their young with small insects as well. If you don't have a leaf litter layer there. Earthworms are not always accessible. They will feed their young with earthworms like robins would do, right? But earthworms are not always accessible. If you have a drought situation, the earthworms go down, they survive, but then they are inaccessible to the salamanders or to the birds. Well, if you have an intact leaf litter layer, the drought situation always is not as dramatic, and they have something to forage on, spiders or anything else.
Well, a lot of complexity, and I'm glad you're looking at it because it's very important stuff.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you spending a little time. I know we're just touching the surface of all the interesting work that you do.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
For an online archive of all our Green Room shows, go to ewashta.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.